Okay, so connected. If anybody's out there already, let me know if the audio is okay. Good. Yeah, thank you. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving last week. Okay. Got a few people popping in already. So we missed last week for a couple of reasons. It was American Thanksgiving, and I thought about just moving the time, but it's also at the end of the month my bandwidth gets restricted, so I probably wouldn't have been able to connect anyway. I think in going forward into the future, we may be going to 3 streams a month if this continues. But we'll try. We'll see. We should be okay for tonight. Good evening, Miroslav. Still got a bit more than 5 minutes. Got 9 people on. Do another couple of minutes. A few more people coming in. We're almost ready to start. Another minute and a half or so. Good evening, Ted.
It's 6 o'clock.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So this evening, we're going to continue with our cosmology series. I've gone through the various realms of existence. Now I'd like to talk a bit about the origins of the world system. First of all, it's important to bear in mind that although this is in a sense a origin myth, it's not ultimate origin, because it's a general principle that samsara is without a beginning. The Buddha himself would not, this is one of the things he would not pronounce on when he was asked about the origins of the universe. He said it was an unanswerable question. But it's a very strong tendency in the tradition afterwards to assert that samsara is beginningless, which some people have a problem with that idea, which is a limitation more of the human imagination than a logical problem. We tend to want to think of things having a first beginning. But logically, if you're going to accept a principle, which is a foundation stone of Buddhist philosophy, the principle of causality, that nothing arises without a cause, nothing arises either arbitrarily or randomly, however far back you go in time to moment X, there's going to be a moment X minus 1, or else moment X would be uncaused, which would be a violation of causality. So theistic religions generally insist on a first cause, which is usually God, although it was already in Greek philosophy, the idea of a first cause or a first mover was present. But in India, that wasn't always so, and it was quite definitely not so in Buddhism. So I think in India generally, there has been a tendency to see time as cyclical and as not linear. And this is one of the very big differences between Eastern and Western thought. That in the West, and this is even pre-Christian, but it's very, was strongly embedded in the Christian tradition, the idea of time as a linear sequence with a beginning, an unfoldment through a history to some climax, and then a final resolution and an ending. And so one of the implications of this then, or the results of this, is that history matters. Whereas in India, time is cyclical. Things keep going around and around in endless, eternal repetition. So the Indians never had a strong interest in history or chronology, which is a nuisance for modern scholars. It's very hard to date anything in India before the invasion of Alexander, and we have the date of that from the Greek side. So the Indians had this sense of time as being just endlessly flowing in circles. So any particular unfoldment of things was just part of that cycle. So this, when we talk about origins of the world system, we're not talking about ultimate origins, because that doesn't make any sense in the Buddhist context. We're not talking about a first beginning, but there is also a principle of impermanence, which is very important. So nothing is permanent. Nothing is eternally abiding. Everything's constantly coming into existence and going out of existence. And that includes a world system. And by a world system, that would be referenced in the Pali as Chakrawala. We're referring to Mount Sindaru and the 4 islands and the Great Ocean, and this ends up being, as I've called it, it's the functional equivalent of a solar system, but it's not the physical equivalent. No, there's no sense in the descriptions of a world system of the sun being at the center. The sun is a minor peripheral character in the whole thing. Mount Sindaru is the center. And this world system is repeated endlessly on all sides. There's multiple world systems. And ours is just one of them. And it has a beginning and an ending. It has a definite limitation in time, although it's very, very long. A period of existence of a world system is called a kappa or a mahakappa. And it's said by the Buddha that to measure the duration of a kappa in years or thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years is not easily done. It's such a long time. But as an example, he said, imagine you had a block of solid granite, a yojana on a side. The yojana is about 15 kilometers. Imagine you had a block of granite, a yojana on a side, and every 100 years a sparrow comes by and brushes it with its tail feathers. That block of granite would be worn down before the kappa run out. So we're talking in immense periods of time for the existence of a world system. And after a world system is destroyed, there's a long period of emptiness. In that sector of the universe, there's nothing. It's just a void. And then, because of the karma of all the beings that perished in the old world system, eventually that eventuates the emergence of a new world system by the force of their karma. Is in the individual case, when a person dies, assuming they're not an arahant, at the end of a person's life, the last moment, there's still karma outstanding, and there's an energy or an impulse for that consciousness to arise again to fulfill its karma, but it cannot do so associated with the same body because that's dead. So it arises somewhere else, and that's rebirth. And that happens on a vast scale with a new world system. There's all these beings perished without anywhere to go, so to speak. And that force of karma generates a new universe or a world system, not a universe, a world system. And the first thing that occurs in the beginning of a new system is a great deluge of rain that pours down from above and is held in place by a cyclone of winds circling around it. So it's like a huge column of water that fills up the entire space of the earthly level all the way through the heavens. And then as that water subsides, these various realms appear, generated by karma. And the first realms to appear are the higher ones. So the Brahma realms appear first, and the realm appears first, and then beings are born into it. So they're born into empty space, empty realm. And that comes up as an important detail in the career of a Brahma god. When a Brahma god appears in he appears in an empty palace, and he's the first one in that realm. He believes he's the supreme being. And after some long time, he wishes for companions. And other beings are born into that realm as lesser Brahmas, according to their karma. And he believes he's created them by his wish. So he develops the idea that he's the great creator, the Mahabrahma. This coming into existence continues downwards through the sensual heavens, one by one. First, the realm appears together with its palaces and so on, and then beings appear in it, spontaneously born. And eventually, as the water subsides all the way, it comes down to the terrestrial or earthly level, and the earthly realm comes into existence. And one of the first things that happens in a new earth is that as the water subsides, the first living thing that appears is a lotus plant, and it will have a number of buds on it, anywhere from 0 to 5. Excuse me. And one of the deities from the Pure Land comes down and to check, because the number of buds on that lotus indicates the number of Buddhas that will exist in that world system. So that's the emergence of the physical world system. Now, for the biggest source for most of what follows, which is the emergence of humanity, is the Aggañña Sutta. It's Digha 27. This sutta has attracted a lot of interest, and various scholars have studied it and commented on it from different angles. There's a lot of different takes on this sutta. It's quite an interesting text to study. It's quite rewarding. Aggañña means origins. And I think there's a connection here, an etymological connection with Genesis, which is a Greek word. The Bible in Greek, which then we translated into English, used the word Genesis for the first book. And I think, and Greek is an Indo-European language, as is Sanskrit and Pali. So I suspect there's a direct link there with the GEN or GAN as the primary element in the name. They're both stories of origin, and there's a couple of curious similarities between the two. They're quite different in most ways. In the Aggañña Sutta, we begin the story here with the earth already formed, but it's still in a primordial state. It's covered in water, and there's a heavy, thick atmosphere, so the sun and moon are not evident. The Pali used is quite specific. It's Panyati is evident. It doesn't say they don't exist. It says they're not evident, or not visible, or not known. So this description of the early earth is quite reminiscent to the modern scientific view of the early earth, which was congealing out of the primordial nebula. But in any case, this earth, this early earth, was uninhabited at first, and then beings from the Abhisara realm, which is the second level Brahma realm, which is equivalent to second jhana. Beings from that realm, when they passed from that realm, they reappeared in a similar form above the earth. So they were essentially floating above the earth. So these kind of angelic beings that were described as self-luminous, glorious, feeding on bliss, moving through space. They were the first conscious entities to appear in the vicinity of the earth. And they stayed like that for a very long time. And then as the earth cooled and congealed, on the surface of the ocean, there appeared a nutritious foam, in Pali as rasa patawi, which is described as similar to the skim that appears on boiled milk. So this nutritious foam appeared on the surface of the primordial ocean. And some of these fallen Brahma beings became curious about it. So this indicates that even at this point, they were not really Brahma gods anymore. they hadn't fallen very far from that state. But a Brahma god does not have any sensual desire or even any sense of taste. But these beings wanted to taste the nutritious foam out of curiosity and desire. And some of them took it up on the tips of their fingers and tasted it. And immediately doing that, they fell down to the surface of the earth. They lost a great deal of their Brahma nature, and they became more coarse material beings. Now, I think the most straightforward interpretation of this is a myth describing the descent of consciousness into coarse matter. So from a higher plane of consciousness, then falling or entering into this more concrete material plane. There's a book by a modern scholar, Dr. Suguna Siri, where he attempts to interpret the Aggañña Sutta in terms of modern scientific concepts. And in a lot of places, he finds quite interesting parallels. One is here at this moment, this juncture, because the modern hypothesis for the origin of life on Earth is that there in the early sea there was a lot of naturally occurring amino acids and some high energy particles from space or from the sun entered into the sea and caused chain reactions and the beginning of more complex life. I know this theory is sort of the most commonly accepted model. It's not very well worked out. It's very much a hypothesis, but it is possible to interpret the Abhisara beings, who are glorious beings of light, entering into this primordial sea as energy, being the initial spark for life on Earth. Anyhow, to return to the Aggañña account, now these beings were still quite glorious and powerful relative to modern humans, and there's a series of stages they go through in devolving from the Abhisara beings down to the sorry two-legged specimens we know today as human beings. And this can be broken down into 7 stages, which is another curious parallel to the biblical Genesis, which has 7 days of creation. And in the Aggañña Sutta, the first stage is the Brahma god beings in the sky above the earth. Then the second stage, they fall to earth after tasting the rasa patawi. And then in the third stage, in a gradual process, their bodies coarsen and become harder, more material, and some of them retain a great deal of their initial beauty, and others become more ugly. And in the ones who are beautiful, arrogance and conceit arises, and they believe themselves to be better than the others. So this is the first, or it's actually the second stage of the degeneration of these beings. And they continue to degenerate through these stages according to their morality. Their morality gets worse, they degenerate. So the first one was desire, and then now we have arrogance and conceit. And as they devolve, also there's a parallel devolution in their food supply. From the rasa patawi, which is very much like the food of the gods, and as the conditions in the earth change, this food changes as well, and it becomes something like a fungus or a mushroom, and that's their main food supply. And at this point, we can mention another interpretation of the Aggañña Sutta, which is that of Professor Gombrich, who reads the whole thing as being the Buddha's critique, or as a satire on the Brahma's version of creation, the Brahman's version of creation, because this sutta is actually delivered to the Buddha, speaking to a Brahman, and in the initial passages, he's refuting the Brahman's idea of the creation of the world. And in this particular stage, when the beings develop, some of them develop an ugliness. This is described in the Pali as a bad vana, which is color, but it also means caste. It can also mean beauty. It's a very multifaceted word. So the Buddha could be seen here as criticizing the origin of caste prejudice at this point. So we now have these beings living off a kind of mushrooms and becoming coarser and more material, and some of them are better looking and some of them are ugly. And this continues on into the next stage, the fourth stage, and the mushrooms turn into creepers. Then in the fifth stage is another critical one, where there is a division in the beings between male and female. Previously, they had been asexual. And this is also found in some Greek myths. In Plato's Symposium, he has Aristophanes recounting an origin of humanity as originally human beings were very powerful beings with 2 heads and 4 arms and 4 legs. And they were so powerful that the gods were afraid of them. So the gods split them in 2. And ever since, beings are only half of a complete unit, and they're constantly spending their life searching for their other half to complete themselves. So that was a Greek version of the same sort of thing, that these beings developed the sexual differences between each other, and they started to naturally become attracted to the opposite sex and fascinated by the appearance of the opposite sex. And some of them who had, and this is always a gradual transition, so there's some who have made this transition and some who have not completed it yet and still don't have sexual differentiation. The ones who were sexualized begin to pair off and have sexual intercourse. And this offends and disturbs the other ones, and they attack the ones and say, how can beings do such a thing to one another? This is gross, this is disgusting. And they chase them away, throwing clods of earth at them and so on. So they begin building huts to conceal themselves so they can perform the act in private. And that's the origin of habitations, of building. There's also a curious passage that says, apparently in ancient India, it was a custom for people to throw ash at a newly married couple. This, like sometimes in modern times, you throw rice at a married couple, newly married couple. And the sutta says this was the ancient origin of that custom. That now is considered a blessing. At first, it was considered a curse. So then the food supply then becomes a kind of rice. And it's different than rice as we know it, in that it grows on the plant already in fully ready to cook white rice grains. And the beings would go out every day and gather their rice. And they had these magic stones that would heat up, and they cooked the rice on these stones. But as their devolution continued, and their morality continued to decrease, the next stage was when beings became acquisitive and lazy, and they said, why should we spend time every day gathering rice? Let's gather a whole bunch at once, enough for several days, and store it up. So storing food, hoarding food, was considered the next stage in the devolution. And it caused an undue stress on these rice plants, and they were no longer able to be as productive. And they would only give their yield after great work, as modern rice is very labor intensive. You have to plant it and reap it and thresh it and cook it, and not just have it ready to go off the plant. So this could be interpreted as a transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. And it's also interesting or significant that storing or hoarding of food was considered a stage of degeneracy, because that is one of the things that it said an arahant will never do. It's a vinaya offense for monks to store their own food overnight. For what they receive in their hands in the morning, they have to consume, and they're not to store their own food. And that's a rule for monks, but it's a natural habit of arahants. They never store their food. So when beings started storing their food, then the plants degenerated. And when the plants degenerated, they had to work to plant the rice and cultivate the crops. So this was then the institution of private property, because previously you just wandered around and gathered the rice wherever. Now, if you went to the trouble of planting and plowing the field and planting the rice and all that, then you wanted to make sure you and your family were the ones who got it. So you said, this field is mine. So private property came into the world. And after that, the next stage of degeneration was, after private property, then theft appeared. Because there were some shameless beings who said, why should I plant rice? I'll just steal it from my neighbor's plot. And with that occurrence, then violence arose because people would defend their plots with sticks or whatever and drive away the thieves. And the thieves would respond in kind. So the initial primitive harmony of the community was broken. And then the next stage in the evolution or devolution was that the early people got together and said, we need to make an end of this violence and disorder. We should elect one amongst us to be the leader, and he will have the power to punish wrongdoers and keep the peace and protect the property rights. So this is the origin of government and kingship. And they elected a king, Mahasamata, who was the first king in the world. And the dynasties of India at the Buddhist time, they claimed descent from Mahasamata. He was the origin of the royal families of India. So this is interesting detail in a couple of ways. One is it's a very early occurrence of what's called social contract theory, which is a political idea in the West. We know it from John Locke, for example, the idea that society originates with a contract, an agreement amongst people. The people get together and say, we need to have a king to keep order, and they elect a king, and that starts the kingship. Right? And rulership or governance was the one who wielded the stick. And we still see that that today, the danda, the stick, is the scepter or the mace. Here in Canada, which we follow, our government system is based on the British. So we have some very archaic traditions around our governing body, and Parliament is only legally in session when the mace is present in the chamber. It sits on the table in the center, and when they open Parliament for the year, there's this big ceremony with guys come in dressed in kind of 18th century costumes, and they carry the mace and they lay it on the table. And if they take the mace away, which they do from time to time, they take it out of the room. So then the Parliament members can have a loose discussion without anything being binding. And it's only binding, the law is only binding if it's in the presence of the mace. And the origin of that is the danda, the stick, wielded by the king. So it's because monopoly of violence was the idea of the early kingship. So that was the so this is how the Aggañña Sutta describes the origin of human beings and the origin of society and government and private property. And from this this point on, then we've entered into what would be called early historical time. So we pass from mythology into the emergence of kingdoms and history as we know it. So I think I'll stop at that point, and I'm thinking next week I'll round up round off this cosmology series. I'll do one more on the future, what is supposed to happen in the future, and the end of a world cycle. So we discussed today the origin of a world cycle. Okay, so I'll stop there, and we'll see if anybody has questions. Pop them into the chat if you've got a question. Interesting parallel between higher spiritual beings falling from that state due consuming rasa batawi, then a bifurcation of fallen beings into good, bad, and ugly, and the fall of Adam and Eve from a state of innocence due to eating of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Yeah, there is that has struck me, that there is that curious parallel, that the beings, the initial fall from grace in both mythologies is um, through the sense of taste. They want the rasa patawi, or they want the apple. Yeah. What is the karma that causes these Brahma beings to fall to earth atmosphere from the Brahma realm in the first instance? It would be just the natural exhaustion of their karma that kept them in the higher realm. So they actually deceased from that Brahma realm and then reappeared on the earth level, but the earth level was not yet ready to accept coarse embodied beings, so they had this kind of transitional phase. When our minds are inclined towards nomadic monastic lifestyle, does that indicate some sense of wisdom in this? I'm not sure. Do you mean, like, are you thinking that the mind is tending back to a more primordial state? I could see that, like the state of before the institution of private property. Beings lived in a more natural existence. Is this just one world cycle or every world cycle? It's every world cycle. There may be differences in detail. Things don't repeat exactly, but the general pattern repeats again and again. This world cycle will come to an end. There'll be a period of emptiness, and then a new world will arise, following basically the same pattern. Did the story of these beings skimming neutron from the oceans come from the Buddha or predate Buddha, etc.? No, as far as I know, this is unique to the Buddha, because the Brahmas in the Vedas had a completely different origin story, which the Buddha was actually criticizing, that everything was created by the great Brahma. And there's actually a couple of different versions of the creation story in pre-Buddhist versions. And one of them is that it was a great sacrifice. There was a divine being called Pajapati who allowed himself to be sacrificed, and he was cut into pieces, and the pieces became like the mountains and the seas, and eventually the animals and people. Okay. Paul is continuing from his previous question about the nomadic / monastic lifestyle, seeing the house from the house building stage. Yes, I can see that. Maybe I can reformulate the mentality. Is there a level of wisdom in this evolution or devolution that corresponds to the Eightfold Path? Yeah. Well, there's. It's hard to say if it's really wisdom as such. It's a natural process. These beings went through, and they were in a more pure state before, so you could say maybe they were more wise. There's also in the cosmological vision of the world system, the Chakawala, the island on the other side of Sinaru, Uttarakuru, the beings are there live in a state that is similar to the state of humans before the devolution to agriculture. They live in a state of primitive innocence and have no private property and just wander about, and their food is readily available. Were these originally fallen Brahma beings capable of seeing the great Sinaru from Earth when they first fell? No, they would not have been able to, because even if they had been natively able to see it, there was the sun and moon were not yet evident. That's, I guess I left that particular detail out. But when they fell to the earth, there was still no sun and moon to be seen, and they had their self-radiance, but when they fell to earth, they began to lose their radiance, and the world was in darkness. And then the clouds gradually dispersed, and they saw the sun and moon, and they rejoiced that there was light back in the world. Are beings able to catch a glimpse of this process by entering a higher state of mind and saying directly their mind the origin of the world after mastering fourth jhana? I don't know. I don't recall anyone other than the Buddha who claimed to know these things directly. Greetings, Bhante. Like you say, were the beings that actually sent to Earth really Brahmas if they were curious about the taste? Yeah, that's quite true. And the commentary is actually specific about that. The commentary deals with this point and says that as soon as they fell to the earth level, even though they had still the form and appearance of Brahmas, they should not be considered Brahmas anymore. They're already Manusaloka, that is part of the human realm. You'll say they were a kind of transitional phase. Another aspect of this is that there is a sense that when we as humans, when we develop jhanas, it's like we're remembering, because that's in this deep sense, it's our primordial nature. It's our previous nature was equivalent of jhana. And then we got tangled up in this material stuff and confused. Can you elaborate on where the Pure Land Deva came from to spot the lotus flower? The Pure Lands, or the Sudawasa in Pali, are 5 realms, very high, remote heaven realms that are considered part of the Rupa Loka, where those beings who are anagami, that is third stage of enlightenment, where they are reborn. So they come from that very high plane, and they're surveying their origin. They see the earth coming back into formation, and they wish to see how many Buddhas there are going to be in this age, and they rejoice if they find buds on the lotus plant. Shambhala is often mentioned as Pure Land. Does this land exist both on earth and in the Brahma realms? Not in the Theravada version, no. The pure lands, the Sudawasa, are only in the heavens. So they existed before the first Brahma. Yes, they did. Their lifespan is so long that many world systems will come and go that they will be aware of. No, you're welcome. So I think maybe we're kind of running out of questions. If there's any last questions, or please put them in now, or else I'll be ending the stream shortly. Is the primeval lotus just like one's extent, or even since extinct, or would it be some unique divine once blooming plant? I think it's more like the latter, a divine once blooming unique plant. I don't think it's like an ordinary earthly lotus. Do Pure Land teachings have stories about this as well? Not that I know of. I'm not sure. I'm not really well studied on Pure Land school. Okay, so take my leave. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next week. And next week we'll have a cheerful topic about mass destruction, the end of the world system. Okay.